Good morning, you guys. It is Saturday, the 13th of August, 14th of August, whatever. It's the last few days of Women in Translation Readathon 2022. I've read one book from a woman in translation this week. I'll talk about that a little later in the day once I'm more of a human. I got off to a slow start with the Readathon and with Women in Translation Month in general because my brother's wedding was last weekend and I had to travel for it to Colorado. I'll insert a picture here of my siblings and me looking very, very happy. I was in the bridal party for my sister-in-law, which is where I got these pajamas, incidentally, and also is the reason that it was more than just one evening. You know, it was like a multi-day, many-event affair, and I was totally exhausted when I got home from it on the eve of the actual readathon this week. Honestly, though, if I finish even a second book this weekend, which I'm hoping to do with our group book at the very least, that'll mean that I've read 2+ books this week, which is better than most weeks in the year of 2022, I'm not gonna lie to you. Anyway, in addition to the group book, I have a whole stack of books that I bought as potential options for this month. Potential options were done in this morning. You want to chew your brush? Attack. Redress all the wrongs it's done to you. Don't hurt yourself. All right, remember, it's like a porcupine. Something you've never encountered in your whole life. All right, good girl, you're finished. Good girl. You ready for this? Here, buddy. Come here. Aw, good boy. Good job. He knows when it's his turn. We do this every morning. I also clean their eyes and their noses because they have little flat faces. And maybe once or twice a week I have to clean Lila's ears, which is a whole other proposition. And again, alright, skincare time. I'm thinking of doing a video in the coming weeks, like reflecting on the actual circumstances of my life and why I read so much less now than I used to. And it's not even for some of the more obvious reasons, like the fact that I was working in publishing and I'm not anymore. There's been a fundamental restructuring of the way I spend my days in the past few years, which is totally normal. It's called aging. You change things about your life as you age. But it's kind of a funny story because a lot of it has to do with my undiagnosed illness, celiac disease. I think I was undiagnosed, given like symptoms and stuff, probably for about a decade. And it's weird to think about how much of my energy or lack of energy because of that disease contributed to me being the type of person who would sit on the couch and read many hours a day. Anyway, today's gonna be kind of an old school day. I don't even think I'm gonna change out of these pajamas if I have anything to say about it. And I'm mostly gonna read and study check. All right, this is all step one. I'm gonna go feed the babes and then be back for sunscreen. Giacomo's eating like a hog, like he does every day. Look at all that food that you shoved out of the bowl with your nose. And now this is my favorite part of the meal to observe. It's the part where he licks the memory of the food. Bye. You look surly from this angle. Now for the secret of how I stay this pale. It looks like a lot, because it is, but I promise it's gonna dry down. Wow, I just realized when I do this, it's like I'm in a Hall of Mirrors video. I've eaten breakfast, brushed my teeth, and most importantly, cleaned the litter boxes, which means now I can think of other things. Now I can think about books. The first book to mention is the one I've already read this week, Iza's Ballad by Magda Szabó, translated from Hungarian by George Szirtes. I think that's the Hungarian pronunciation. Could be wrong. I'm probably wrong. Iza's Ballad is from the early part of her career. She published her first book in 1958, and this one was published in 1963, in contrast to something like The Door, which I think was published in 1987. Initially, the book mainly follows a country woman named Eddie, who's in her 70s, and whose husband is dying of stomach cancer. And their daughter, Iza, is taking care of everything about his final days. And Eddie is really appreciative of this because Iza's always been the type of woman to take charge. There are these early tensions of moments when Eddie would like to have made a decision about something and she couldn't because Iza already had. And then the majority of the book transitions to when Iza invites / demands that her mother comes to live with her in Budapest, the capital city. And Eddie has always been a country girl. And when she moves to the big city, she finds that it's a lot more bustling and modern and newfangled than anything that she'd experienced before. Lisa is a doctor. She works long hours. And the primary conflict in the book is their differing ideas about how they want to spend their daily lives and how they wish to interact with each other. Isa wants her mother to just relax. She says, I make plenty of money for both of us to live comfortably now. You've worked so hard all your life and you're old, and I'm afraid that you'll injure yourself or make yourself sick if you work too hard, so please just calm down. But Etty lived in poverty for most of her life, and she's used to being somebody who's just naturally industrious, and she doesn't like sitting around. She feels useless. I didn't expect this book overall to be as melancholy as it was. Without spoiling anything specific, I'll say that it is not a redemptive book, and I need some more time to think about what it says about generational misunderstandings and the relative value of the ways that different generations live. Because ultimately, I don't think that this is an extremely flattering book to the new generation of the time, the generation of the 1960s, who are moving further and further from the values of their parents. Truly, Magda never misses. I started the group book late last night. It's called Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex by Oksana Zabuzhko, translated from Ukrainian by Halyna Hryn. And I'm 20 pages into this. It's about 160 pages. This is right up my alley. I think I'm gonna love this book. And I also can instantly see why it has something like a 3.6 rating on Goodreads. It is not going to be everybody's cup of tea, especially because of the format. It's largely stream of consciousness, but more like a torrent of consciousness. It's a woman, I think in her early 30s, who is just railing against her situation in life. At this early point, she's mostly been describing an ugly relationship that has ended. At least I hope it's ended for her sake. And she's also writing about certain experiences performing her poetry publicly, particularly when she's performed it in Ukrainian. And I'm hoping to read the majority of this book today. And then, since I didn't have time to film the TBR video I expected to film before I went to my brother's wedding, I wanted to mention a few other books that I might pick up during the rest of the month. Isa's Ballad already fulfilled the first prompt in our readathon, the hard track of which was to read an author that you've read before. But this book also falls into that category. It's Voices from Chernobyl, The Oral History of a Nuclear Disaster by Svetlana Alexievich. And this is translated from Russian by Keith Gessen. This is my last Svetlana Alexievich book in English. It's become something of a personal tradition at this point to read a Svetlana Alexievich book during Women in Translation Month. And this is arguably her most famous book in the English-speaking world, which is part of the reason that I've saved it for last. I have 4 others I've pulled from my shelves that I know very little about. The first is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. This is translated from Polish by Antonia Lloyd-Jones, recent Nobel Prize winner, and I've never read a full book of hers. Sweet Darusya, A Tale of Two Villages by Maria Matios, translated from Ukrainian by Michael M. Naydan and Olha Tytarenko. I do know that this is a family saga set during the era of brutal collectivization. Another Women in Translation tradition is to hold up a book that I bought last year for Women in Translation Month, and this year's candidate is Trieste by Daša Drndić, translated for Croatian by Ellen Elias-Bursać. I've started this a few times, and it's quite a dense, obsessive feeling book about a woman who's looking for her son who was fathered by an SS officer. I use the word fathered there. That's, yeah. We're going to have to see how accurate that verb is. And this son was stolen 62 years ago by the Nazis. And then the final book is Sovietistan by Erika Fatland. This is translated from Finnish by Kari Dickson. And this is travel writing about Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. I don't expect to get from this the same thing I would get from writers who are actually from those countries. I'm well aware of the limitations of travel writing and of that automatic gaze of an outsider, but I am interested to see what a woman world traveler makes of these countries in Central Asia that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Shall we begin? about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I did some orientation stuff for school. I read about half of Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, and then I took a blissful nap. And when I woke up, I remembered that I actually do need to leave the house today, which is awful, obviously. So I think in addition to my errands, I'm gonna stop by a cafe to study a little bit. I tend to study Czech best when I'm outside of the house and can focus a little more. At the moment for Czech, I'm technically studying below my current level because I'm reviewing so much and drilling a lot of previous vocabulary and grammar that I can use fairly comfortably, but that I want to be able to use really seamlessly. So once I finish putting this sunscreen on, I will take you with me. You know those lazy weekend days when you say to yourself, I'm going to read a ton this afternoon, and then you do a few errands, you clean a little bit, cook a little bit, respond to a few emails, pay your medical bills, and then suddenly you just don't have an afternoon anymore. Hello from the darkness. If I'm crediting correctly, I think it was Jenny Odell in How to Do Nothing who talked about the maintenance of life. I think that was the phrase she used about, how much work and time and effort it goes into just maintaining the state of things. She talked about that in contrast to viewing life only as a matter of progression, only as a matter of moving up the chain of things and getting ahead, when it takes so much work just not to constantly fall behind. I still haven't read that much more of Oksana Zabuzhko's Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex, but now that I'm not both ravenous and living in filth anymore, I'm gonna curl up with it on the couch for a little bit. Speaking of curling up on the couch, gorgeous, gorgeous girl. I'm winding down for the night. I don't know if you can hear Giacomo snuffling his food behind me. I'm going to have a long play session with them and then probably start Voices from Chernobyl in bed. But I have about 50 pages left of Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex. You guys, I love this book. I'm mostly just going to tell you whatever images of this book flash into my mind. And just the fact that I mentioned images and flashing is indicative of what kind of book it is in some sense, because the descriptive imagery is gorgeous. Gorgeous in this book. You can tell that Zabuzhko is a poet. I think she's incredibly successful, and through the mediation of Halyna Hryn, at transmitting that poetic sensibility into poetic prose. This is about a woman, I believe, in her early 30s, who's gone through a divorce after a tempestuous marriage. And when I say tempestuous, I do mean that euphemistically for what you would guess: abusive, violent, etc. My favorite elements are the little digressions all throughout this monologue about her Ukrainian identity and the feeling of isolation of being a Ukrainian poet, the feeling of isolation internationally and also at home as well, in terms of speaking Ukrainian instead of Russian, having a clear sense of Ukrainian history and identity and literature, whereas most of the men she's ever been with have not, and she's felt like she needs to be their teacher. It's such a sensual, bitter, frustrated, overflowing type of novel. I've annotated this book to hell. That's all for today. I'll check in with you again tomorrow morning. One of the many reasons that I almost never vlog, I think the last time I did was in 2020, is that vlogging makes it difficult to mask my insomnia as much as I tend to mask it in my everyday life. I don't like talking about it with my friends and family because there's nothing they can do to help. And it's such a common problem for me that if I brought it up every time it happened, we would start most of our conversations that way. I just don't see the point in it. Also, people's instinct typically is to give advice or, ask questions about what you're doing to try to improve your sleep habits. And they ask that because they care about you and they want to help you, right? But, for example, when someone asked me if I've, tried melatonin or something, it's like, why don't you just offer me Neosporin for my shark bite? Like, if melatonin is fixing your sleeping problem, then we don't have the same sleeping problems. You know what I mean? But also, I'm interested in the ways that people tend to think there's a root cause and therefore a cure for every physical problem that you have. And I really do hope that there is a cause to my insomnia that I haven't discovered yet and that I can cure it at some point. When I have better health insurance, I'd like to see a specialist. But I also think there are certain basic human functions that certain human bodies, for whatever reason, do very poorly. There are certain bodies that don't digest food well. There are certain bodies that don't breathe very well. And the body I have doesn't sleep well. And it never has. And it's not because I'm doing things wrong. But sitting here, very, very tired, I can at least say that I almost finished fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex sometime between 3:30 and 6:30 this morning. Again, I'll save my more specific and interesting thoughts for the discussion that Kendra, Matthew, and I are going to have. Based on the descriptions of it and the kind of halting way that even people who like it tend to recommend this book, I didn't expect it to be this readable. I'm finding the internal logic of it, once you're in the rhythm of the book a little bit, it's like extremely readable. I also read about 40 pages of Voices from Chernobyl last night. And wow, this is like cry until you pass out type of stories, let me tell you. This is one of the main inspirational texts for HBO's miniseries Chernobyl, which I've seen a few times. Obviously, there are moments of historical inaccuracy because of, compression in that miniseries. Overall, I still think it's excellent at the main things it's trying to achieve. And I think because I'd seen some of those stories enacted like brutally on screen, I'm not as shaken to my core by reading them because I've already experienced them. If I hadn't seen the miniseries, I think the first story in here would have wrecked me and truly kept me up all night for a specific reason this time. I'm also finding, at least in these early sections, that as I've suspected for a long time, this might be where I recommend people start if you've never read Svetlana Alexievich's books before. And after I've read this, sometime this fall, I'm hoping to do an author spotlight on all 5 of her books that are available in English and recommend a sort of reading order if you're not sure how to get into her work. I'm going to be leaving to meet Matthew in about an hour. We're going to be reading and studying at McNally Jackson, and at least that's something to look forward to. Cheers to a better rest of the day, huh?
Can I pick up a book?
You can do whatever you want.
Is this going to be underscored, overscored? Should I...
Probably going to keep this audio in.
She's just such a gem. She's such a beauty. She's the perfect size.
She really is.
Literally, we're like Gollum.
The quality we have on these shelves. Truly, if you want Eastern European lit, come on down to McNally Jackson, folks. Don't even waste your time at the Strand. Hi again, it's Sunday evening on August 14th, and this is going to be my last check-in for the most mundane vlog that was ever mundane. Matthew and I had a great time at McNally Jackson. Unsurprisingly, we didn't actually end up reading together because we were talking the whole time. And then when Matthew left, I stayed and studied a little more Czech. I finished Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex on the subway, and I'm on about page 100 of Voices from Chernobyl. This happens to me with every Svetlana Alexievich book. I think this is a familiar author. I love her work. I'm fascinated by these topics, and I'm going to fly through this when what inevitably happens because of the subject matter is that I read for 20 minutes and then am catatonic for the next 20 minutes, rinse and repeat. It's funny though because I'm bigging myself up on like how much reading progress I made this week, and meanwhile Matthew was like, yeah, I think I've read like 12 books since 2 p.m. yesterday. He obviously didn't say that, but that's my impression of him. So to wrap up the readathon, for the harder version of the first prompt to read an author you've read before, I read all of Iza's Ballad by Magda Szabó, translated from Hungarian by George Szirtes. And I also dipped into Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich, translated from Russian by Keith Gessen. I read the group book Fieldwork in Ukrainian Sex by Oksana Zabuzhko, translated from Ukrainian by Halyna Hryn. In my book, that is counting toward the third prompt also, which was to read a book that brings you joy, because it definitely did the trick. The one prompt I didn't meet this week was to revisit a book, but there's still plenty of Women in Translation month left, and I'm going to take that opportunity to revisit some of Wisława Szymborska's poems. These are translated from Polish by Stanisław Barańczyk and Claire Kavanagh, and I read this maybe somewhere between 3 and 5 years ago. This is her collected poems, and I want to go through and look at some of my annotations that I made at the time and which poems spoke to me then. Got myself comfortable a little early tonight because I'm about to do my Czech homework for tomorrow. I meet with a Czech tutor twice a week. She lives here in the city too, but we meet over Zoom. And tomorrow we're going to be discussing the Czech film Closely Watched Trains, which is based on a book that was written in the 1960s by the very famous Czech writer Bohumil Hrabal. I read the novella earlier this year and loved it. I actually thought that I had read it before, but I hadn't. I'd seen the movie before. That confusion almost never happens to me, but there you go. Hrabal published the novella in 1965, and then in 1966, this movie came out, which is a real classic, and it's directed by the famous Czech director Jiří Menzel, and this was his first feature film production, so it kind of has that element of movie history also. It's about a barely pubescent young man named Milos, and one of my favorite parts of the novella was the opening. It's kind of an iconic opening because he's naively and warmly discussing his family's history of failure and ignominy, basically. Not that he would frame it that way himself. Milos is getting himself ready in the morning in his snappy new uniform to go work on the train platforms where, you know, he helps facilitate mostly German armaments, because this is happening during World War II. At this point, Czechoslovakia has been split into Slovakia and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, and you can tell by the name that this was occupied by Nazi Germany. So there's a real uneasiness to the setting, in the novella at least, and I'm interested to see, you know, and be reminded of like how that was portrayed on film, and it's in great contrast to the overall tone of the book, which is largely about sexual awakenings, and you could say, you know, sort of dormant national sentiment waiting for, you could say, an explosion, an eruption to bring it back to life. One of the greatest things about language learning is that your homework, you know, in addition to all the grunt work and brute memorization involved, is, you know, reading books and magazine articles and watching movies and TV and listening to songs, those sorts of things. I think I'm going to have a great homework session tonight. I'm going to leave you here. Thank you so much to the 2% of you who've made it to the end. I really appreciate you spending this time with me, and I'll see you soon for another video.